Krystal, I really wanted to have you on to talk broadly about this ongoing and arguably worsening problem of working people in the US just becoming more and more alienated and detached from the political process. And
Yeah.
of course, that's like a huge umbrella, and there's a lot to cover under that. But I want to start with the media question because you actually came on the Jacobin show over a year ago. If memory serves, you and Kyle Kulinski had just launched Krystal, Kyle, and Friends. And then, of course, a few months after that, you and Sagar went rogue from the Hill and you launched Breaking Points. And, both of these shows have been like wildly successful. And I also want to put that in the context of the last year or so sort of seeing this explosion of like independent newsletters, Substacks, obviously, YouTube shows and podcasts and so forth. So I guess the first question for you is, given that we now kind of have a robust, if still informal, collection of independent news sources, do you think that independent media is starting to become a force that can rival traditional media?
Um, we're not there yet,
Yeah.
but I do think that there are a lot of hopeful signs. And so I'm glad you start with this question because it is actually a hopeful place to begin. You now have a growing ecosystem. You have, one of the things we try to do at Breaking Points that we've been doing a lot lately is bringing people in who, have their own thing, but that we can help promote. So Matt Stoller with his big Substack newsletter on antitrust and monopoly is one example of that. There's a fantastic new YouTuber named James Lee, 5149, who does incredible breakdowns. He's got one posting for us this week on the private equity industry. So I do think that there is a lot that's hopeful there. And at the same time, I think there's a giant target on the back of independent media creators for a variety of reasons. Not least of which, I think when Joe Rogan went to Spotify and they paid him $100 million or $200 million, and I don't know exactly how big the package was, there was suddenly this big capitalist awakening of like, oh, this is not just people, doing this little side thing and it's completely irrelevant. There's big money at stake here and gigantic audiences and gigantic influence. So I think that was kind of an eye-opening moment for the capitalists. And then you also have, of course, this whole narrative and movement towards there are things that are happening in the country that we don't like. So instead of engaging with those things or trying to win the debate or trying to organize to better things, we're going to try to censor, we're going to try to clamp down, we're going to try to control the conversation. And that obviously is a direct threat to independent media. And then you have big players like CNN trying to get into sort of like their own independent media game, quote unquote, with their streaming efforts, which are doomed to fail because they've brought on the same boring, same old talent that no one is interested in hearing from with the same corporate mentality and perspective that they've had everywhere else. But now they see themselves as sort of competitors in the space. So again, that means the knives are out. Yeah. So on the one hand, just to kind of like sum up that rather long answer, on the one hand, I think there's never been more promise. I think there's never been more space. I think there's never been more platforms and more ability and more hunger and desire and just like, thinking in market terms, there's a massive hunger for more independent voices and a different perspective. But I also think there's a gigantic threat coming from established players.
I want to build off of that because, one major theme of Breaking Points, which I love, is I really feel like you guys de-emphasize culture wars and political polarization. And what I mean by that is not that you steer away from controversial topics or like don't cover certain things, but you make very clear that so many of the culture war battles that we're seeing today are distractions from the massive chasm between the rich and everybody else, and often by design. So I guess the question is like, how do we move beyond culture wars when obviously both major parties and the mainstream media are constantly adding fuel to the fire? And then maybe specifically, do you see an opportunity for the left in particular to kind of stake out like an alternative political position that sidesteps some of these culture wars?
Yeah, so this is something that I really do think a lot about because, like you said, you don't want to avoid things that are important. I don't want people to think that culture is irrelevant, that I don't care about these issues, that they don't matter. What I try to steer clear of is the culture war fights that aren't actually important, which
Right.
are just about having a fight,
Right.
and we have a lot of those,
Mhm.
right? So, in terms of, where are the hopeful signs, or how do we build on that, or how do we get to this place that culture wars are so central? I think you have to start from the place of, when our politics fail to deliver basic material security on like an obvious level for the vast majority of people, of course they're going to give up on either of the political parties delivering for them in that way.
Yeah.
So in the, Reagan era and in the neoliberal era, with material politics sort of like off the table in terms of making meaningful gains, well, yeah, it makes sense that people would gravitate towards these cultural signaling reasons for their vote, or they would just opt out entirely.
Mhm.
So if you don't expect a politician to actually better your material condition, then you're like, okay, well, are they going to at least signal they're sort of like on my team in the culture wars?
Right.
And so that's how I think we've ended up in this place. I think the most obvious answer, and again, a hopeful sign that we have right now, is in a reinvigorated labor movement. I'm actually, you can't see it, but I'm wearing my Starbucks
Oh,
Workers
yeah.
United t-shirt.
Amazing.
Right now, they just won 3 more elections today.
Yeah.
That is, you can't, I mean, look, it feels small in a certain sense, but Starbucks had never had an American store,
Right.
a US store,
Right.
unionized.
Right.
And now you've got 6, and you've got elections across the country that are scheduled in a tidal wave, and you've got
Over 100, I think.
Yes, and you've got votes coming up at 3 Amazon centers,
Mhm.
2 on Staten Island, and then the redo in Bessemer, Alabama. I mean, that's a massive, massive shift,
Right.
especially when you put that in the context of, the Red for Ed teacher wave, and you see it as sort of like, a movement that's been building. Yes, it was interrupted by the pandemic, but now it's coming back. If you're going to have a class-centric politics that truly involves a multiracial working class, it has to start with the labor movement. So, I really think that part of looking back, and this is putting another piece here, but looking back at what happened with the Sanders campaign and why some of the voters that we hoped, those disengaged working class voters that we hoped would show up, didn't ultimately show up, is because we needed the time of building the labor movement, building that solidarity, and building that sort of foundation, like the energy we saw at the John Deere strike, in able to convince people that there was something for them to gain materially in, electoral politics. So that's kind of how I'm looking at the landscape right now.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.